Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today to speak with Dr. Aziz Nazah. We are discussing clinical trials and the clinical decision tools. My name is Fiona Evans. I am the Director of Patient Advocacy here at Massive Bio. So thank you, Dr. Nazah. Welcome. And please give us a little introduction.
Thank you, Fiona, and thanks for the opportunity to be with you. So I'm Aziz Nazah. I'm a medical oncologist by training and currently work as Executive Director in Early Drug Development at Insight Pharma. Before that, I was at the Cleveland Clinic, and I conducted clinical trials for patients with leukemia, as well as the Director for Center for Clinical AI at the Cleveland Clinic.
Great. Well, thank you for joining. So we'll jump right into the questions. Why are clinical trials considered crucial for medical research and healthcare advancement?
So as you know, while there are a lot of advancements in the treatment of patients with cancer in the last decades or so, first of all, these advancements came from participation in clinical trials, but today we still, there are so many cancers we cannot cure. There is a risk of relapse or less for the patients. So we know that we need to do better, even though our treatment are better. So the only way for us to move forward and do better is by exploring new treatments and new opportunities. And in order for us to do that, obviously, we can't just go on experiments. We have to do it in the context of the clinical trials. So it's critical, especially for patients with oncology, that participation in clinical trials that enable them to have access to novel therapies that they wouldn't have access to if they don't participate in the clinical trials.
Right. Yep, that's correct. So what are the primary challenges faced in conducting clinical trials, and how can they be addressed?
Yeah, so there are so many challenges on a different levels, and you could say, challenges of building and conducting clinical trials. So let's say from pharmaceutical companies' perspective, you have challenges of conducting and enrolling on the trial. So there are some challenges of the physicians in the hospital that conducting the trials. And there are some challenges for patients to participate in a clinical trial. So you could sort of, divide it in that way. So obviously there are so many of these challenges. So in order for us to, I'll give you some few examples because that's going to take a while to address and talk about all these challenges across all spectrum. So if you think about it from, we start from patient perspective, sometimes it's hard for patients to qualify for clinical trials. So some of the trials have rigid inclusion and exclusion criteria, which which make it sometimes difficult for some patients to participate. Access to clinical trial from patient perspective, because some of the time these clinical trials are only available in academic centers that are maybe somewhat far away from the patient. So you have to sort of travel distance to be able to enroll in clinical trials. And depending on the phase of the clinical trial, sometimes participation in these trials can be lengthy, meaning that the patient has to come to the clinic in, let's say, in phase 1, many times even during the week to receive treatment, get samples for these clinical trials, which will be a burden on the patient. From a hospital perspective, I think after the COVID-19 pandemic, hospitals still feeling some stretch in their infrastructure, as well as the availability of research nurses, which sort of delay opening clinical trials, delay managing clinical trials, because the personnel who are supposed to run the trials in the hospitals, we have shortage in them now, and that's across all United States. So makes it more challenging to run research from infrastructure perspective as well, from personnel. From pharmaceutical perspective, there's always the need to kind of push these trials to make it available to the patient as much as possible, as soon as possible. But then, pharma sometimes face these issues of trying to plan a study, let's say globally or in the United States, and what are the centers can participate, and how can you motivate the centers to enroll and participate and stay on touch on these trials. So sometimes can be challenging again because the environment and the personnel, the infrastructure change dramatically over time, especially now post-COVID. So you can see there are several forces can impact trial, achievement. This is why it still takes between 5 to 7 years to get a drug, let's say from discovery, or what we call it the IND, to approval.
Yeah, and that can be a long time, for patients. Even as you mentioned, from the patient perspective, it's difficult to navigate on their own. They need help from physicians. Massive Bio is helping to enable all patients to have access to clinical trials because it is so challenging. We like to take all of that work away from the patient so that they come to us and we're try to make the process as simple as possible. And I always tell patients that if they participate in a clinical trial, aside from the benefit of receiving a novel treatment early on in the process, they also get a little bit extra TLC. They're monitored a little bit more closely. They have someone available, usually a research nurse navigator that's helping them along the way. So are there any other ways clinical trials create opportunities for improving patient care and in clinical trial decision making?
Absolutely. I mean, you mentioned really important points of motivation for patients to participate in clinical trials. So there are certain cancers and diseases where there is really no good treatment. So let's say patients receive a standard of therapy, they, for some reason, do not respond or relapse. At this stage, they don't have any other options. So clinical trials can open novel options for them to participate in it, where in areas, again, that there is really no other available therapies. And certainly some of these trials have novel approaches that will enable them to access novel technologies that hopefully in the future actually change the course of the disease. You also mentioned, closer monitoring. Certainly patients will be more closely monitored if they are enrolled in clinical trials compared to non-clinical trials. The downside to that, sometimes it's add more extra layers of added lab work and other stuff that are specific for clinical trials, because it's very important. The number one job of these trials, first, to protect the patient. Right. Second, to see if the drug can actually help the patient. But that's the number one question in any, especially in early drug development trials. Is this drug safe and not harmful to the patient? And I think having that, diagnosis with cancer is very devastating for all patients. So having an option or multiple options today, especially we have multiple clinical trials that patient could qualify, I think that's sort of open more hope for the patient that they can have access to something that honestly overseas or somewhere else is not available.
Yep, that's absolutely right. We're going to jump into the technology side a little bit here. How do predictive analytics, machine learning, and artificial intelligence contribute to clinical trial decision making?
Certainly. So if you think about the goal of any trial is to give the right treatment to the right patient at the right time.
Right.
And that's easier said than done, because we most of the time don't know who is the right patient to receive the therapy and what is the right time, now, later, in the future. So this is where predictive analytics come from. So can we predict which patient or subpopulation of patients that have the highest response to a novel therapy. Can we predict, can we diagnose these cancers, especially the rarer ones, in a better way to make them more eligible to qualify for the trial? Can we identify biomarkers that can predict response or resistance to the novel therapy? And then can we predict outcomes based on survival or whatever endpoints we need to do? So you see, there's a lot of prediction that enable us to do a better job. The question is then, how do you develop these models that can predict those things? So traditionally, we have used traditional statistics, for example, to predict outcomes for patients on clinical trials to try to tease out subpopulations of patients that qualify or have a higher response rate, and trying to use diagnostic tools to improve our diagnostic abilities, especially for rarer types of cancer. So today we have the opportunity to use machine learning and AI to improve our ability from diagnosis of cancer to prediction of response and resistance to therapy, to prediction of prognosis based on therapy, and also to try to develop novel drugs using AI and machine learning. Now, it's recognized that while there is a lot of excitement about machine learning and AI, in healthcare is still in early stage. So while there is a lot of potential and promise to use this technology again to use, for example, to identify cancer, um, from me or
No, it looks fine.
okay.
Are you?
I was hearing like somebody's moving things, so sorry.
Oh,
So this is why.
so
Sorry.
that's okay.
See, I still feel like that's exists. So I don't know if it's an echo or you hear me fine now.
I can hear you. Yep.
Okay. So I lost my train of thought, but I'll come back.
Yeah. Sorry
So
about that.
no problem. So
Yeah. Jihan's saying it's not coming from me. I don't know.
it's okay.
My air conditioner is on, but like I can
No, I
barely
don't
hear
think
it.
so.
So.
Yeah, it's okay. So 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 there is an opportunity to use machine learning and AI to improve all of those, from diagnosis to prediction of response to therapy, prognosis, and also in drug development. Um, as we were discussing, it's the machine learning and AI perspective in healthcare is still early in its early or nuance journey, meaning that we still need to have better tools or better way to use these tools to improve our job. So as of today, we're still not using it at most. I mean, we're using it here and there, but not in that many trials. So you could imagine, for example, using computer vision to make better diagnosis of cancers on slides, identifying the cancer on pathology slides, whether hematologic malignancy or not. There are also big emphasis on using what we call it multi-model approach to try to integrate several type of data. This could be radiology, pathology, genomics, clinical data, and try to blend all these data into models that can, for example, predict biomarkers that identify patients who have a higher response to therapy or a higher resistance to therapy, and try to understand how that response or resistance happen. And then there's also now a new initiative of trying to identify targets and validate these targets in the cancer using AI and machine learning, as well as define and identify molecules that is designed by AI and machine learning.
Wow. Yeah, that's great. So there's a lot coming that will be useful in decision making in clinical trials. So, what are the potential benefits and limitations of using predictive analytics and AI in clinical practice?
So the benefits is obviously building more robust models that enable us again to identify better patients, select patients better for clinical trials, identify patients who have a higher response to therapy or they might not respond to therapy. So it gives us this, the easiest way to think about machine learning is an AI is it's a powerful tool, but it's not a magic wand. And I
Right.
think a lot of people think of it as a magic wand. You sprinkle AI on something and it happens. It's really at the end of the day, it's a powerful tool. So enable us to build things in models that we were not able to build in the past because we have better data now and we have better models. The challenge to implement these in healthcare is how do you develop the model? Do you have the right data? Because we still struggle sometimes sharing data on clinical trials of clinical trials. These models need a lot of data, and due to HIPAA regulations and others, and difficulty in sharing and acquiring data in healthcare, make it difficult to build these models, and making sure that the models is reproducible and accessible, because you could build a model, publish a paper, but that doesn't mean you can use the model, and doesn't mean the model result will replicate on the clinical trials. So we still have a lot of work to do in terms of addressing some of the challenges of these powerful technology that hopefully, if we use it in the right way and the right place, hopefully will yield a very high impact on our patients and a clinical trial that we never dreamed of in the past.
That's great. Uh, so, how can decision tools aid in the development of clinical trial protocols? They're, a challenge, right? So, how can that help or aid that?
So it's we go to, what we discussed at the beginning is, can we find the right patient, the right treatment at the right time?
Mm-hmm.
And that's where the predictive analytics comes to say, this patient's giving all the clinical characteristics, the genomics, and the other type of data will qualify for this trial and hopefully have a higher response based on these biomarkers that we have. So this is sort of the power of these tools. Rather than treating, let's say, all patients with the same treatment and
Mm-hmm.
maybe 30% of those patients will respond, the question, can we identify those 30% upfront and give them the treatment, and then don't give the treatment to the other 70% who don't respond? So
Right.
this is where the promise of this, are we there? Maybe in some ways, in a small subset of patients, but definitely we need to do much better.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point. It will help too, I think, with the quality of life of those patients, whether they're the ones that are using the AI driven decision making or not. Is that right? Like for the 70% that we know that, okay, that treatment is not going to be effective for them, I think it will improve their quality of life, by having a different treatment or, another option possibly.
Absolutely. I mean, if you think about typically some of those treatments, especially novel targeted therapies and biologics, in some and most cancers, sometimes we give it for about 4 months,
Mm-hmm.
in some cancers 6 months before we claim victory or defeat. So
Mm-hmm.
if you're giving a therapy for somebody and they have a chance of not responding 70%, and you spend 6 months getting therapy and probably get some side effects, I don't think that's an appealing,
Right.
way to do things. But if you're able to identify those 30 patients, even with higher probability, see,
Mm-hmm.
I don't think we will get to a way or a model that's going to be 100% correct.
Right.
And that's
Right.
fine.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, it's all about probability. It's like going out and, and you're looking at the weather forecast and say, there is a 30% chance of rain today. Would you take your
Mhm.
umbrella? Or the
Right.
same weather channel saying there is a 90% chance of raining today. Would you take your umbrella at this time? So it's
Right.
all about finding probabilities and discussing those with the patients and try to align it with the patient goal of the therapy. So the promise again is how do we have that high probability that these subset of patients will respond to therapy, and we have the confidence of the
Mhm.
model to say so. We're not there in most of the time, and there are some tools actually that get us there, but we still have a lot of work to do to get there.
Right, right. What factors should be considered when using decision tools for patient selection in clinical trials?
The most important part, in my opinion, especially when you talk about machine learning and AI tools, is the external validation and the reproducibility of the model. You can't just take a model that was just published and wasn't validated in real life and wasn't validated in multiple different clinical settings and plug it in clinical trials. That will be dangerous, in my opinion. So having a model that is valid, that is accepted, and validated and reproduce the same result in multiple different settings across multiple institutions. Let's say not just in the United States, by the way, globally.
Mm-hmm.
If you have that tool, then it makes sense. The challenge is how do you do all those sets of validation and acceptance? That's a lot of work, especially if you're trying to do it globally. So if you look at most of the machine learning and AI models are just published and based on one center, one experience. And most of the time when you take this model, try to implement it in a different center, the model is not valid. And that makes it more challenging because if you're not reproducing the same result, then there is a chance that you're actually harming patients, not benefiting them.
Right, right, exactly. Can you provide some examples of decision tools that have successfully optimized trial design and patient selection?
Yeah, so I treat patients with cancer, hematologic cancer, and a blood cancer called myelodysplastic syndrome. This is a form of blood cancer. And if you think about drug development, the FDA always try to have risk stratification tool to approve the drug. So risk stratification meaning patients who have lower risk of disease, lower risk of progression. Typically in cancer in general, we treat them with lower intensity therapy, and sometimes we don't even give them therapy. Where patients with higher risk of progression, higher risk of death, we tend to be more aggressive. So finding a tool to tell you this patient is a higher risk versus lower risk becomes important. So we traditionally have used the International Prognostic Scoring System, or IPSS, as a tool to discriminate those, to separate those patients. And in the drug approval, you will find the drugs that are approved for patients with higher risk and patients with lower risk. And then we updated that to the revised IPSS, or revised International Prognostic Scoring System. And then there is a new prognostic scoring system called IPSSM, which is the molecular version of that scoring system. And this was built based on international collaboration, multiple centers around the world, validated. So hopefully when we move to the IPSSM, that will be another decision tools that will enable us to, again, separate those patients into lower and higher risk. And that will be incorporated in clinical trials because, you have different trials and different endpoints and for higher risk patients compared to lower risk patients. But that's an example of a decision tool. Now, it's not based on machine learning and AI, but it's a decision tool. So again, machine learning and AI is a powerful tool, but as long as you build the final product, whether you use machine learning, whether you use traditional statistics, and that model is accepted, validated, all over, then that's what would be great.
Great. How can real-time data analytics and surveillance systems improve trial monitoring and patient safety?
Yeah, so this is another excellent point that we don't do well these days at where, when we enroll patients on a clinical trial, we collect data driven from the patients. Typically, that data is entered in the site of the patient's enrollment. So at the site where the patient get enrolled, there are some clinical research nurses and operation that put that data into a system, and then this data kind of pulled together in one system, and then we analyze the data.
Mhm.
The challenge that we have today that people who put that data, they typically takes them some time to put the data. So it's not really a real time, meaning that, by the time you put the data in the data set, lock it, and then extract it, probably the patient's already finished or off the clinical trial. It's critical, it's important, because if you're able to get streamlined data, you will be able to intervene in the trial much faster. Unfortunately, it's harder to do in real life to get that real-time data
Mhm.
because of all the challenges of who will enter the data and how you will enter the data.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Um, so, what are some of the challenges associated with patient identification and enrollment? And how can decision tools help overcome them?
Yeah, so I think that's one of the other biggest challenges is how do you make sure that the patient will qualify for the clinical trial. So, and these trials have specific criteria. So it's not like, oh, well, stage 4 lung cancer. Typically, there are multiple other criteria for the patient to qualify. And then you have to go through one by one to make sure that the patient
Right.
qualified for the trial, which a lot of burden. Obviously, it's not something patients can do. It's because it's a lot of medical terminologies that sometimes
Right.
makes it very difficult to identify. And because you don't want the patient to go through the process, what we call it screening, and go through all this process, collect the data, and put it all together, and then the patient doesn't qualify because this is the exclusion criteria. So I think this is one of the biggest challenges for the patients. Is how do you find the right trial that they qualify for without spending too much time, energy, and traveling to several sites to be able to find that trial.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Can you share some examples of successful data-driven patient recruitment strategies?
So I mean, there are several companies like Massive Bio were trying to actually have put the patient in the center and try to collect the data on the patient and then match them with the clinical trial that they qualify for. I think this is very important because one of the challenges in clinical trials is in some or most of these clinical trials is low accrual to the trial. And low accrual to trials makes it difficult then, to push the therapy as fast as possible to the patient. I mean, we talked about the process takes on average about 5 to 7 years. With lower accrual, it can take longer, and that's not good for anybody,
Right.
participating in the trial. So how do you expedite that? Again, by identifying the right patients to get the right treatment at the right time, and this is how you try to match patient with clinical trials.
Yep. And that, here at Massive Bio, we're using artificial intelligence technology to do that. So we're trying to do it in, record speed to get those patients identified for the right trial at the right time. So, we are super excited about that and happy to get moving as quickly as possible for those patients. So how can real-time data I'm sorry, that's the question I just asked. Skip to the next one. What type of data is typically monitored in clinical trials, and how do decision tools facilitate this process?
So depending on the trial, there are several type of data. So it could be sometimes you collect samples for the diagnosis. So you have a tissue sample. So let's say you have a lung cancer, that will be a tissue from the lung. You have a hematologic malignancy, it could be a bone marrow biopsy. Again, depending on the trial, sometimes you have radiological reports, and you could only have the actual report, or you could have the CT scan or the PET scan or the MRI. And then most importantly, you're collecting clinical data. And in some of the trial, you're also collecting genomic data depending on the type of trial. Some of them will be directed against a small specific genomic alteration, so you'll be able to collect that. So that's generally speaking. Now, some of the trials, especially on the early stages, they will have what they call it exploratory analysis, meaning they collect extra samples to try to run different type of laboratory tests that might still not in the prime time, but might give some information in the future, like single cell DNA sequencing, single cell RNA sequencing, plasma proteomics, and all of this stuff. So sometimes what you end up doing, collecting samples to run these tests subsequently. So there are some standard test and data that you need to do on the trial that's required per the trial, required by the FDA, that you have to do those things again just to assure the safety. And there are some extra stuff that sometimes you collect depending on the trial to try to explore novel opportunities in a novel technologies on the trial.
Okay. Are there any notable examples of real-time data analytics being used to enhance trial monitoring and safety?
Yeah, so we have seen some use, which is still started still at the beginning. For example, of Fitbit, or a watch like a smartwatch, to be able to measure, for example, activity of the patients on the trial, their sleep patterns. There are some trials where use this glucose monitoring. There are some trials that use a temperature sensor that you can put, and it can send sensing where the temperature of the patient happen before it happens, or sometimes before it happens. And when that happens, hopefully alert the physicians to treat the patients before they go into, let's say, sepsis, and they get really sick because of the treatment that they get. So this sensor type data from different sensors and those things start entering some of the clinical trials. I would say it's not routine. We're still trying to figure out how do you use that data, how do you have enough of that data. And then when you start implementing those things, obviously there are layers of complexity of, it's not as simple just to throw let's say an Apple Watch on a patient arm.
Right.
They're really, from consent perspective, who gonna charge it, how the patients will keep it, who's gonna download the data, where do you put the data. There's so many complexity of just doing all these type of data, but we start seeing some of its implementation in some of the clinical trials.
Great. What are some specific tasks, processes in trial management that can benefit from intelligent tools?
I mean, the whole thing, right? So if you think about just a simple example, data collection, we today collect that data manually, which takes time and labor. And so you have to hire many data extractors that they put the data in the database and those things. So if you're able to automate the process of extracting some of that data and structure it using machine learning and AI, I think that will help expedite the process of collecting the data, having real-time data, and will be very beneficial for all the clinical trials. So I think that's one example of automation that sort of help expediting clinical trials.
Got it. This next question, it sounds like you already touched on it, but maybe you can give more information. What are some specific tasks or processes in trial management that can benefit from intelligent tools?
So I think that's part of it. I mean, we talked about data collection, patient identification, automated patient identification. So people talking about this new idea of patient tokenization. So think about it like you have patient information that logged in a token, and that token get accessed and analyzed to see if that patient qualify for this type of trial or other type of trials. So patient identification, if you can automate that, it's another process. Obviously, opening clinical trials, there are multiple steps that from putting the trial, reviewing the trial, and all this, contract negotiations and those things. You could automate some of these processes to make it faster to open these trials at the sites. And then once you conclude, obviously, the trial, again, data collection, cleaning, and putting it together to be able to report on the trial, and whether you have an automated tools that enable you to expedite that process becomes very important.
Got it. What ethical considerations arise when utilizing decision tools in clinical trials, and how can we address those?
So this is why we talked about very important aspect of when you talk about machine learning and AI is the validation of the model.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And making sure the model is not biased and the model is applicable in a different setting for different patient population. What I mean by biased model, if the model doesn't have or built, let's say, on a certain patient population that doesn't reflect the entire patient population. So then if the model is making, or you're making decisions to enroll, not enroll, treat, not treat based on that model, you might be discriminating against some of the patients, which
Right.
means you might be denying therapy or giving inappropriate therapy to sub-patient population. So, for example, if your model doesn't have African American patient population or Hispanic, and you're trying to apply the model in African American patients, would you get the same result? And are you denying some of the therapy to those patients? So this is a very important ethical consideration when we talk about machine learning models in terms of bias. And bias is bias in the data, bias in the model, bias in the prediction. And each one of them, we have to kind of think about it and address it in a different way. Another thing in terms of those tools, how do you put the data in the tools and where do you collect the data? In the healthcare system, we have a HIPAA requirements and regulations of security and safety of our patients' data. So having that data just on a server, not protected or without a protection even on the cloud, becomes a challenge. So you really need several layers of security to
Yeah.
ensure that this data is protected before you'll be able to use it. So these are a couple of examples of things that we need to think about before using some of these models in clinical trials.
Absolutely. What regulatory implications should be considered to ensure transparency, privacy, and compliance with decision tool usage?
So I think the FDA has done a good job of addressing some of the regulatory implications on how to use these AI and machine learning models, if we think about that. But also, even the FDA recognizes there's still a lot of work to be done
Right.
to address. We talked about some of the transparency of the model and privacy, meaning data protection, and the compliance with the regulation and the HIPAA and all of the stuff. So there's so many layers of complexity to these decision tools that we need to address, obviously in collaboration with the FDA, to make sure that these tools are reliable before we start standardizing them in clinical trials.
Right. Are there any guidelines or frameworks in place to assist researchers in navigating these ethical and regulatory aspects?
Yes, so there are some FDA guidance on the use of AI and machine learning as a device. There are also some publications to address those. In my opinion, we need way more because these, in my personal opinion, these regulatory and guidance of the appropriate use of machine learning and AI in healthcare in general and in clinical trials needs more work, more regulation, more guidelines, more attention to those. Because I think sometimes we get so occupied by the potential of the technology
Mm-hmm.
without focusing and addressing the drawbacks of a technology.
Right.
Any technology has potential and drawbacks. And as
Right.
long as you address the drawbacks and the challenges, that's fine. But I don't think we still addressing them properly in healthcare in terms of machine learning and AI.
How do you foresee decision tools evolving and influencing clinical research in the coming years?
So certainly we will start seeing more of machine learning and AI raised more now, and how do we use it in healthcare? So we're going to hear a lot of that. I think there is for sure a huge opportunity for AI and machine learning to expedite, improve, and enhance the clinical trial delivery for the patients from all perspective we talked about, from drug design and drug development, target identification, biomarker identification, trial enhancement and expediting clinical trials, and even when the drug is approved after that. So, across the whole life cycle of developing drug for a patient. So there's a huge opportunity in each of these pockets. There's a lot of hype too at the same time. So we have to sort of find a way to tease out the opportunity from the hype. And as we discussed previously, address the challenges and talk about
Right.
them openly and try to overcome them. Because if we're able to address them and overcome them and harness the power of this technology in the decade to come, I think we will have amazing things that we will be able to achieve using machine learning and AI in drug development.
Right. Okay. So there's tons of opportunity out there. In terms of, physician to patient, when you're seeing your patients, what's some information you share with them? Like, do you lead them in the direction of clinical trials? Do you have something that you generally, point out to them? Or, what's your experience there?
Yeah, so it's all about education, right? So
Mm-hmm.
we have to educate our patients on how to understand why these trials are important, what's the
Mm-hmm.
mechanism of the drug and action, educate them about their disease and the status of their disease, and then how that trial will help them to achieve their goal. And also explain, I feel like sometimes we need to explain better the types of trials that the patient qualify. A phase 1 trial is different than phase 2 is different than
Right.
phase 3 clinical trial. And I typically in my practice spend a lot of time talking about those things, explaining what the trial is, the stage of the trial, and then what the patient expect from the trial.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the critical key here, expectations. How do you set up expectations where the patients actually understand what they are signing up for
Mm-hmm.
without over promising or under promising? Just the right expectation, what you expect from the trial. Because if you laid out this very clearly to the patient, I think you will have better success with the patients to navigate through the trial journey.
Yeah, I agree. That's very important. I think educating patients is really important. And, here at Massive Bio, we try to do that with all our patients. And, we know that physicians are doing that too, which can only increase enrollment and help, future outcomes of all of these uh, trials and drugs that are coming our way. So I thank you so much for your time. We appreciate you sharing this information with us. And, I hope you have a great rest of the day.
You too. Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you.